Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ayaan, welcome to the show.
Brendan, thank you very much. Nice to see you again.
You too. It's always good to have you on. I feel like there are a million things I want to talk to you about, things that have been happening in the world. I guess I want to start by talking about freedom of speech, because in the week that we are talking, you've written a brilliant piece for The Spectator on freedom of speech, and particularly on the crisis of freedom of speech here in the UK, which is an issue close to my heart as well. And I want to dig down into some of the points you make about the creep of censorship through Britain and through much of the Western world, in fact. But I guess I'll start by asking you how bad you think things are getting in the British context in relation to freedom of speech, but also, I guess, more broadly in the West. Are we really in a dark moment when it comes to this fundamental liberty?
I think we are at a crossroads where we really have to make a choice. And what I hope is the silent majority will stand up and say, we don't want this anymore. There's a real crisis. I came to the West in 1992, so it's about 30 years ago. It's a little over 30 years ago. And the issue of free speech was completely settled. Legally speaking, anything that had to do with defamation, libel, perjury, incitement, all of that stuff was taken care of. There were some countries that had blasphemy laws, but they hadn't used them for what? When I came 60 or 70 or even longer, they were dead letters. And then three things happened almost simultaneously. And the first one is the arrival of radical Islam as an ideology laced with religion that wants to dominate and that demands that blasphemy laws be brought back for itself. It starts with 1989, Salman Rushdie, Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, the supreme leader. He called himself the supreme leader of Iran. I think most young people don't know this, but had issued a fatwa, which is basically a death sentence on Salman Rushdie. And Salman Rushdie was never safe. It was only 2 years ago, I think, that he was almost killed. But what I remember from the 1989 event and in the years later was that the government in Britain, led by Margaret Thatcher, was unequivocal. And freedom of speech is one of the defining, if not the defining pillar of our civilization. And I think she basically told Ayatollah Khomeini the equivalent of what Elon Musk told the European Commission the other day. And she protected him. And there were debates in England and in the rest of the West about what are the boundaries of free speech. And I think back then it was really seen. I know people who shouldn't have said this, you shouldn't have written it. He did it to provoke, coming from the left, by the way. But I would say by the time I come and I start to speak Dutch and I start to understand how things work in the West, it seems very, very clear that it was sort of a one-off. Of course, it doesn't stay that way. So when radical Islam develops and we see, we get 9/11 2001, we get the terrorist attacks in Madrid in 2004, we get 7/7 in 2005 in the UK. And after that, we carry on terrorist attack after terrorist attack and all these discussions that have to do with the limitations of free speech. We get the cartoons in Denmark, but they're all centered around Islam and how do Muslim minorities fit into the West and how do we integrate them and how can we meet, halfway, or this concept of multiculturalism is brought in from Canada and from Australia and all these other countries, and they tried to transplant that into Europe and say, look, we can have this integration while you keep your own identity. In other words, don't discriminate or make any kind of moral judgment between these different cultures. They're all the same. And we're going to end up in sort of one happy place. And none of that works. It's just utopian. We see now that it doesn't work. But the other development, I think, and it relates to this, I touched on multiculturalism, the other big ideological movement that we overlooked in the 1990s, 2000s was the left. There was something brewing on the left side of the political aisle. And this has to do with, in some ways, the revival of revolutionary socialism. So when I lived in the Netherlands, I was initially a member of the Social Democratic Party. And if you look at the history of socialism, you have the revolutionary wing, and then you have reform wing. And this revolutionary wing was supposed to have been put to bed in 1989 after the fall of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, for most of us, that's not what happened. What happened is we, the winners, who thought, yippee, communism is over. It's now time to celebrate. And you remember the famous title of Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History. I think we moved on, and this revolutionary left did not. And it came back in the guise of cultural identity politics. Look at society and divide it into those who are oppressed and those who oppress, and those who oppress are the white man, heterosexual. So you can see the racial component there. And then everyone else is segmented along gender lines, racial lines, BIPOC, people of color. This carries on. And I think we underestimated that particular force. And I think what happened is the revolutionary left started to infiltrate and eat into the reform or center-left parties. So as far as I'm concerned, the Democratic Party in the United States is usurped at the moment by people who came in with Bernie Sanders. That was revolutionary left, the Ocasio-Cortezes of this world. And they're coming in with these revolutionary ideas. And those center-left Clintonian Democrats sit there with feeling quite helpless. They really, in many ways, I think they just don't know what to do. They seem stuck to me. And it's the same with the Labour Party in the United Kingdom. I think when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, he was quite honest. He was quite transparent. And I think one merit of very radical people is that they can be quite honest, actually. And so the British public were not going to give that man power. But then along comes Keir Starmer, looking like mother's best. He's shaven, he's in a suit, and a safe pair of hands type of thing. And people are fed up with the Tory party, and they're infighting. And people feel in Britain that it was time for a change. But with Keir Starmer, I think they sort of believed maybe he would tax us here and the economy wouldn't be so great. But I don't think that anyone took him to be the force behind the abolition of free speech in Britain. And he's doing that. There was in universities, to stop wokeism from coming into Britain and protect British universities from what happened to American universities. The Tories passed this Freedom of Speech Act on universities. He's reversing that with the stupid argument that a lot of British universities have Chinese students and China gives a lot of money and therefore we could get ourselves into a financial problem. I mean, can you see how dumb that is? And then the Islamophobia, they're going to pass that. And I wrote about that a while back, and I'm very suspicious of this relationship between Labour and the Islamists in Britain. But then, of course, there is the Online Safety Act, again passed by the Tories, stupidly so, and Labour is building on it. And there's this phrase that says legal but harmful speech. That's just censorship, in other words. This whole moderation of content is just a way of saying we're going to censor you. And so if you take these three forces together, the rise of Islamism, the rise of the revolutionary left, along with the internet in general, which up until quite recently, the left was abusing for its own ends. And this is only disrupted by Elon Musk buying Twitter and calling it X and opening it up for free speech. I think freedom of speech is in a very, very bad place. And I think it is now for the general public, what we've been calling the silent majority, to stand up and say, we don't agree with these changes.
Yeah, that's a really useful outline of where things are going. And as I was reading your piece, I was struck by two of those elements that you mentioned there in your kind of three-pronged description of the crisis of free speech: the arrival of radical Islam in the West and the rise of these kinds of left-wing critical justice, social justice theories, which are always attended by the most unforgiving forms of cancel culture. And as I was looking at those two things in particular, it made me think, God, when I was younger, I thought we'd got rid of old stuffy blasphemy laws and Stalinism, those two great barriers to free thought and freedom of speech. And lo and behold, both of them have come back in a new way. And you really touch on that in your piece. And it's really well put. And I wanted to ask you about the first one, which you've already mentioned, but in relation to the role that Islamists play, or I guess the relationship played by the interconnection of Islamists with sections of the left and this whole new idea of Islamophobia being the worst crime you could commit. You mentioned already Salman Rushdie, and it is extraordinary when you look at what's happened in the West over the past 40 years, because it's almost like Rushdie won, leaving aside the awful attack on him a couple of years ago. Rushdie won in the sense that he was protected by the conservative political class, at least. He was supported by serious thinkers in the West, although there was a lot of intellectual wobbling amongst certain sections of the intelligentsia. But he kind of won, but so did the fatwa. And we've almost internalized the fatwa in Western societies. We've internalized the theocratic idea that it's somehow wrong and sinful and dangerous to criticize Islam. It will be hurtful to Muslims if we do that. So it's been a kind of paradoxical journey, hasn't it, since the Rushdie affair in the late 80s, where his right to freedom of speech is largely accepted by most good, decent people. But at the same time, we've had the constant rise of this idea of Islamophobia. So how worried are you about the clampdowns on Islamophobia and what that represents?
So I think it's very important I'd say, let's go back the 40 years or so and do a proper review. And I would say re-examine some of the assumptions we made. At least I'll just limit it to my assumptions that I made. So, for instance, I thought this whole philosophy of multiculturalism was a sincere attempt to help Muslim immigrants and minorities assimilate into European societies. So a way of telling them, you're welcome, you are here to stay, we wish you no harm. And as Europeans, we are aware of our own history. So what we did to the Jewish minorities, the Gypsies, to homosexuals, we are aware of that, the burden of that history. And so we really want to make an effort to make you a part of this society without compromising on the values that we have already built and the lessons that we learned from that history, which is all these freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion and conscience, all of these things. You're welcome. You can be here. You can have your religion. And now I go back to that time, and I think I got that wrong. I think that's not what multiculturalism meant at all. I think what multiculturalism was about was this soft touch, revolutionary left trying to get a foothold using immigrants as a way of litigating Western culture and against Western civilization. So it was in the decades before they could say, white privilege and blame the white man, the history of the white man for all things that were bad. And back in the 1990s, it really wasn't about the white man is the oppressor. It is the white man's burden, now that it's the end of history, to civilize the rest. It is he who has to use his taxpayer money, his wealth, and his privilege to bring the rest of humanity along to where he is. That was the 90s. I thought that, multiculturalism was a bad idea, but a benign force. I thought it was coming from a good place. And I'm actually re-examining that assumption and seeing it was the forerunner of wokeism. The moral relativism we see now in the guise of identity politics, where they're reintroducing, indigenous peoples, you fill the blank, bullshit. The attack, the assault on merit, the assault on what is objectively true, the assault on the systems we have built where we say it is about individual rights, but also individual obligations and responsibilities and accountability, the assault on accountability. All of that, if you go back and read these tracts on multiculturalism, it's all in there. They were just using the immigrants. These structures that we have are structures of injustice, and they need to come down. And so wokeism just built on that. The Islamists have an agenda to advance, which is they see it, and theirs is religious, and they're very transparent about it. They've always been clear about it. There's Islam as a political force. So when you define Islam as a political force, then you have Islamism, because then it's a political theory, and that separates ordinary Muslims who are just going about their daily lives from those who are organized around a political agenda to dominate. And first, they started in Muslim-majority countries, and they've got this concept called takfir. If you are not on their side, you're a kafir, you're an infidel, you're not a proper Muslim. So actually, most victims of Islamism are Muslims. And once they radicalize, I would say through thick and thin, by whatever means, then it is to Islamize the rest of the world. Now, in the 1990s, and even for in the 1980s, in the 1990s, the Islamists had countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, Qatar, which still supports them, Iran. They had all this oil money that was thrown at the Islamization process. This starts to change just after ISIS in 2018, after the Arab Spring, after it's very clear to the ruling families in the Gulf states that the Islamists are coming for them too. Not because the Arab monarchies love us, or that they love the freedom of speech, or that they're going to adopt democracy. No, they've understood that these Islamist movements that they've been funding are coming to upend them. Only then have they decided to clamp down on them. And also, I think from a materialistic place, countries like Saudi Arabia have realized, look, they can't depend on oil to keep up their standards of living and to placate a very young population for as long as they've done. So they're opening themselves up to the world economy. So the good thing, something good has come out of this, which is Saudi Arabia is no longer funding Islamist ideology across the world. But Islamist ideology doesn't need to be funded by Saudi Arabia anymore. It has taken off, and it has seeded itself in the West, in America, in Britain, in Germany, in France, all over the West. And it's doing fine. It doesn't need Saudi Arabia anymore. And so the Islamist propaganda, Islamist agenda to Islamize Europe is taking off. And even to Islamize the United States is taking off in ways that gives them hope, more so because of their alliance with the left. The left wants to bring down, the far revolutionary left wants to bring down the structures that they think of as unjust. The Islamists want to bring down those very same structures. So they have a similar agenda. God forbid it's when they get to their agenda that they're obviously going to divert. And the question for me, as I look at these things, all is I know exactly what the Islamists want. They're going to introduce Sharia law. They have a plan. They think it's God's plan that they're executing. And they have imposed Sharia law in so many different communities across the world. And I know exactly what it looks like. But what is it that the woke want? No, if they get power, and they'll get power, they have actually through DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other sinister means, they have taken hold of several institutions. Like I said, they've infiltrated these major political parties like the Democratic Party in the United States, Labour Party here, and on the continent, social democratic parties. But once they get to power, and once they strip us of all these structures that we've built, what is their plan? What are they going to do?
If you're a regular listener to this show or a regular reader of Spiked, why not become a Spiked supporter? Spiked Supporters is our thriving community of people who donate to Spiked. Anyone who gives £5 or more a month or £50 or more a year can become a Spiked supporter and get access to lots of exciting perks. Spiked supporters can comment on articles, get free and discounted tickets to events, get a discount on all items in our shop, and bookmark articles as you browse. This is our way of saying thank you to all of you who fund our work. Spiked is completely free, and yet you still hand over your hard-earned cash to make sure that anyone, anywhere can read us and listen to us. We're incredibly grateful for your generosity. If you don't give to Spiked yet, now is the perfect time to start. Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to set up your donation and your Spiked supporters account. That's spiked-online.com/supporters. That is the scary question that I think people should be asking themselves. And it's really interesting to hear you speak about the unholiest of alliances between this woke left and the ascendant Islamist movement. And it does seem to me that they're united for now by a kind of shared contempt for the West, for modernity, for the values of enlightenment. But you only have to look at the history of the Iranian Revolution to see what an extraordinary folly it is for the left to make connections with Islamists. You know, we all know what happened to the left in Iran who did that. So yeah, it's so foolish and dangerous. And yet for now, I think both sides are benefiting, but that could well change in the near future. But I did want to ask you about that unholy alliance in relation to the post-7th of October moment. So it's not too long until we get to the first anniversary of the worst attack on the Jews since the Holocaust, carried out by Hamas and other groups on the 7th of October 2023. And a lot of what you're describing really exploded into public view after that event. And it was almost like we saw an extension of the pogrom itself on the streets of the West. So we didn't see any solidarity with Israel, hardly, apart from some of us did go out on the streets and show support for Israel, but lots of people did the opposite. And it was almost like an externalization of Hamas's pogrom, because we saw the rise of anti-Semitism. We saw people waving Hamas flags. We've even seen that on campuses in the United States and on campuses in the UK as well. What have you felt about that post-October moment and how it's manifested itself in the West in particular? What has it revealed or confirmed, I guess, about trends in the West that this could happen?
So it exposed this unholy alliance. And again, in the 1990s, the 2000s, when Muslim immigrants settled in the West, and we were having these conversations about to what extent can they actually assimilate? Some of the arguments that were being made in relation to freedom of speech was, I remember this vividly because I had made a film called Submission with Theo von Gogh, and it was before Theo was killed, and then later on it was even after Theo was killed. I was taken to court by some Islamists. And the argument they were making was, okay, you don't want us to use violence. You don't want us to try and behead people or bomb things when our sacred prophet and our sacred holy book and what is sacred for us is insulted. You are telling us you should use the system that we have, which is the system of the courts and so on. So basically, the Islamists were really, really smart. And in a way, I think they had Western society using their own arguments by the throat. And so what Islamists achieved then was not only, I wasn't sent to prison and I wasn't fined, but this was early days. This is 2003, 2004. But you see afterwards, through the legislative system, they tried to get things like hate speech and harmful speech and Islamophobia. They're still trying, and it's working. It's going up and up. But another thing that went unnoticed is a philosophical disagreement between the Islamists themselves. The biggest, most powerful, most prominent Islamist group in the world is the Muslim Brotherhood. And if you study them and you follow some of the internal conversations that they have, one of the dominant conversations is we can Islamize the world really fast by using jihad, terror, and violence. That is one school of thought. The opposing school of thought is no, we can Islamize the world gradually by infiltrating schools, universities, by offering charity. It's a long, gradual process. We've got to be patient. It's called da'wah, converting people to Islam, but also Islamizing, adopting, bringing about various pieces of Sharia. And it's going to be very gently, but we'll get there. And so after October 7, and when I see this explosion of what comes out of American campuses, I think, okay, I go back to that conversation. I start reading up on those discussions. And what you notice is the Islamists who are saying, let's use violence, have taken a back seat. They used violence and they were knocked down. Al-Qaeda. They used violence and they were knocked out of ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Remember all the young people from all over the world who were traveling to enter the Islamic State. That Islamic State was going to be protected by Allah, and it was never going to be toppled, and it was going to be powerful, just like, the Prophet Muhammad's emigration to Medina. That was the idea. But then along comes Donald Trump, and he knocks it out. So within the Muslim Brotherhood, there was this story of let's not do things that way anymore. And with the help of Qatar, with the help of Turkey, with the help of the Islamist Republic of Iran, a lot of money was spent over decades to build an infrastructure within Western society using Western freedoms to build schools, to build mosques, to build Islamic centers, community centers, to build websites. They even use AI right now. And they went really on an effort to convert non-Muslims to Islam, to radicalize people who identified as Muslim to begin with, and to infiltrate different institutions, starting with universities. And in universities, lo and behold, they found the woke, critical race theory, critical justice theory, and that's where that alliance really paid off. So right after October 7, you look at all of these campuses, and they're waving the Palestinian flag. There's no Palestinian state. It's pretty much a Hamas flag. These are pro-Hamas groups. Hamas is a child of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the slogans, it's not just the visuals, but it's the slogans, the things that they are shouting are all things that Hamas was shouting in the 1990s and in the 2000s, and on Iranian soil also, you death to America, but also intifada. All of these genocidal, anti-Jewish, let's eliminate the state of Israel. These things are all pro-Hamas. So it was absolutely wrong of the media after October 7 to frame this thing as pro-Palestine or pro-Gaza. It's not pro-Gaza, it's not pro-Palestine, it's pro-Hamas. And then you have the woke who have formed this intimate relationship with pro-Hamas activists. How long this relationship is going to last and where it's going to end, I don't know. It's fascinating to watch the Democratic convention and the lead up to the general election, presidential election in the United States, where the Democratic Party is trying now to figure out how, on the one hand, to give the Islamists what they want because they need their vote, and the woke what they want, because there are all sorts of elements that the woke have. Think about gay rights, think about transgender, think about women's rights, think about abortion, all of these things that the Islamists despise. How the Democrats are going to keep this tent intact is a very big question. But in any case, October 7, what we see is the anti-Semitism, which was Islamist-driven anti-Semitism, which was with us for a long time. I grew up in it. I was completely marinated in it, and so are most Muslims my age. And the anti-Semitism of the left, of the far left, which it's incomprehensible to me because we have dissected the far right anti-Semitism, what led to the rise of Hitler. And after Hitler was defeated, we embarked on a mission to denazify Germany and the rest of Europe. And I think we succeeded very, very well in that. But after 1989, we never really went after communism and the anti-Semitism within communism, but also communism as the biggest killer of human beings, as an ideology. We never pursued that. So I think there's a lot of work to do before they censor us to silence.
I couldn't agree more with your analysis of where the Jew hatred has come from, where it's been coming from for some decades now, but it could be seen really clearly after the 7th of October in the West. The West found itself in a vice-like grip between left-wing anti-Semitism, a kind of return of an almost violent form of the socialism of fools, as it used to be called, and Islamist anti-Semitism, which is one form of racism you're just not allowed to talk about. Anyone who talks about the problem of Muslim anti-Semitism will be accused of Islamophobia. You now have a situation where it's Islamophobic, apparently, to talk about anti-Semitism, which really shows you the dangers of the censorious drive, where you can't talk about the problems.
Or disgustingly, to equate the two and to say we are banning, and this is, of course, the argument that's also being used by Keir Starmer now, we are banning both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, as if Islamophobia, which is a made-up term and a tool to Islamize Western society, is the same as the hatred of a people for just being a people, for being Jewish, for just hating them for their identity and their religion. So those two things are being equated, and that's, I find, even more disgusting and more sinister, because it shows you just how sophisticated the arguments and how far they're willing to go to use our freedoms and the language, the vocabulary of our freedom to destroy freedom itself.
Yeah. Absolutely. I want to ask you about the woke and what's going on with the woke. because it's such an interesting topic. I just want to ask you one more thing on the Islamophobia question. You've already mentioned your experience in the Netherlands with Theo van Gogh, the extraordinary, tragic case of his murder by an Islamist after Theo van Gogh made a film with you and raised questions about the appalling treatment of women under Sharia law. In particular, you guys made a film called Submission, helping to bring to the fore a lot of these questions. And that's 20 years ago now, I think, or more, maybe just over 20 years ago. And you've been writing about this issue for a long time and really trying to get the voice of reason across on it. So I just want to ask you what, in relation to the Labour government here in Britain, because as you know, and you've already mentioned, they're alongside the Online Safety Act, taking away the Free Speech Act from university campuses. They also are considering adopting the new definition of Islamophobia, which is an even worse definition than the one that existed previously. It's always been a bad word for the reasons you've just said. But the new definition is that Islamophobia is an attack on Muslims or expressions of Muslimness. And you just think to yourself, how much could possibly be encapsulated by a phrase like that? Expressions of Muslimness could cover everything from a woman being compelled to wear the burqa, or the contents of the Quran itself, or even Sharia law. All of these things could be seen as expressions of Muslimness, and therefore criticizing them or attacking them could potentially be seen as a form of bigotry, a form of racism. So this really is a term that exists for, I guess, little purpose other than to crush discussion of Islam. And is that entirely how you see it? And also, if it is, why have even politicians who would define themselves as liberal, I suppose, if you really push them, why are they so willing to adopt a phrase like this?
On the second question, why are politicians willing to adopt this? I think, as we discussed earlier, there was this sentiment of we've got to make Muslim minorities feel at home because of the guilt of the past. Look, we massacred the Jews, we didn't protect them in some countries, and so we don't want to do that to our Muslim minorities. That was I remember living in the Netherlands, and that was a very potent argument. The Dutch felt extremely guilty about the fact that in proportion to Dutch population, more Jews were deported, removed from their homes, and sent to labor camps and gas chambers than any other country in Europe. And so let's not do this to the Muslims. Let's not repeat this history was a very, very powerful argument. And this is what makes me so angry, because the Islamists then and the leftists who have a different agenda, they exploit this. They exploit what is essentially the goodness of human beings to do right this time round, to do wrong. So that's one. Two, there are those with an agenda like this foolish left that we used to call them foolish before, the fools, socialist fools or whatever. But now they're actually woke and they're not foolish, and they're very smart in getting power. And I think what they see is the Islamists want to use democracy as a tool to come to power. And then you have that one man, one vote, one time. They want to abolish democracy. But I think the woke left also wants to do something along those lines. And this far left, numerically speaking, they do rely on the Islamists to vote for them. You see, the white working class, which was traditionally the constituency that voted for the Labour Party, and the Labour Party was founded, and social democratic parties across Europe were founded by working class leaders and working class people, but that has faded. And now these parties rely on immigrants, the new demography, and that's how they can come to power. Again, I want to make this distinction within the left. There's the moderate left, who I suspect do not want to take away freedom of speech, and who I suspect in some ways are overwhelmed by their own far left and the fact that they were asleep at the wheel, or that maybe some of them have become sort of a globalist left. They don't care about the working class anymore. There's this great realignment. People talk about the great replacement, but there's a great realignment. And this realignment is that the parties that used to represent the working classes now no longer represent the working classes. They actually represent the capital. but they still call themselves Labour, Social Democrat, or Democratic Party in the US. So where am I taking all of this? I'm saying that the radical left, which is what we have now, I see Keir Starmer as a front for the radical left. He needs the Muslim vote. And the Muslim vote can be gained because it's the Islamists who can organize the Muslim immigrants to go to the polls and vote. I don't know if you've seen some of these things, but people get, women who can't read or write, they're not allowed to get out of the house. They don't know what voting is. They push a ballot in front of them and put the thumb with an ink, and then this woman has voted. So that type of very skillful organizing is what the Islamists can do. The question that Keir Starmer should ask himself, and other leftist parties that depend on the Islamist vote, is, are you getting this vote for free? What have you got to give them in return? And what they're demanding in return, they have so many demands. The Islamists have so many demands in return. But first and foremost, it is censorship. They want Islamophobia to be made illegal. And the way they define Islamophobia, not the way you and I define Islamophobia, the way they define Islamophobia is any form of criticism on the political agenda of Islam. So if you talk about immigration, if you bring in more immigrants from Muslim countries that run through the infrastructure of mosques and schools and so on and get radicalized and boost their numbers, that's Islamophobia. If you talk about the explosion in sexual violence, boys on the streets going after girls, women, and making the streets unsafe for women, this gang rapes, harassment, all that kind of explosion in sexual violence against women. If you talk about that perpetrated by immigrant men, most of them Muslim, that's Islamophobia. So you can't fight sexual violence against women perpetrated by immigrant men because you're committing Islamophobia. If you talk about what is preached in the mosque, telling the congregation, do not assimilate, distance yourself from the infidels, or bring in members of your family from all over the world so we can settle and colonize and Islamize. That's what's preached in the mosque. If you bring that to the attention of the politicians and you say, do something about it, that's Islamophobia. If you record, and these days, actually, they're not that secretive about it, the blatant anti-Semitism where they're saying annihilate the Jews are pigs and donkeys and monkeys, the state of Israel has no right to exist, you can become martyrs, die while killing them. This is preached in the mosque. If you bring that stuff out and you show it to the politicians and you say, this is what's being said in the mosque, what are we going to do about this? That's Islamophobia. That's the question that you have to ask the governments, the leftist governments that are accommodating and thinking about outlawing Islamophobia, is this is the stuff that's going to be banned. Journalists, the newspapers cannot exercise their free press rights to investigate some of these irregular things or crimes that are committed. Commentators, academics, people who watch what's going on in society. There is soft Sharia that's pretty much established in Britain, where marriages, divorces, and inheritances are sorted using Sharia law, not using British law. If you bring that out to the fore and you say, do we really want this parallel society? These people are settling these issues on. It's Islamophobia. You won't be able to talk about it. If you want to talk about honor killings, women, Muslim women in Muslim households who are beaten, they're curfewed, they're removed from school, they're forced to marry, they're raped. You want to expose this, you're committing Islamophobia. Same for female genital mutilation. That is what Islamophobia is going to ban if you allow it. And you're going to ban it in the name of human rights.
That's really well put. And, the willingness of the woke left, even the moderate left, who are very cowardly on these questions, the willingness of those people to sacrifice women to, never criticizing Islam is extraordinary. And, Muslim women and non-Muslim women both get sacrificed to this agenda if we're not allowed to talk about some of the problems associated with Islam, radical Islam, Islamist ideology, and so on. It is really extraordinary. And the other thing that worries me enormously, I'm sure it worries you, especially given your history in the West, in the Netherlands, every capitulation to Islamist fundamentalists ends up emboldening the fundamentalists, because We have a situation now in the UK where a school teacher from the Batley Grammar School in the north of England has been in hiding for 3 years because he showed his school kids an image of Muhammad in a discussion about blasphemy and freedom of speech. We know what happened to Samuel Paty in France, who was beheaded in the streets. No one talks about this anymore because he committed the same so-called crime. And, you know, when the Lady of Heaven film was released in the UK a couple of years ago, there were huge mobs outside cinemas, and we had the horrific spectacle of the managers of those cinemas coming out, apologizing to the mob and promising to withdraw the film. The kind of scenes you would expect to see in Pakistan or maybe in Iran, not in Britain, not in Sheffield or Leeds in the United Kingdom. And of course, after the Charlie Hebdo massacre, I think some of the equivocation that we saw, I think there was much greater equivocation after the Charlie Hebdo massacre than there was after the Salman Rushdie fatwa, which was a sign of how bad things have got in the preceding 20 years. That equivocation, I think, ended up giving a green light to radical Islamists as well to pursue the same grievances, to make the same threats. So we really are in a difficult situation, aren't we? Because we're emboldening the enemies of civilization the more that we refuse to defend the values of civilization.
Absolutely. The woke left is an enemy of civilization, and they say so themselves. They're deconstructing everything. And then the Islamists are clearly an enemy of civilization, our Western civilization that's rooted in Christianity. And so with these two forces, I think that if we don't get up now, and I'm talking to the silent majority, and say, we've got to stop this before they stop us, before they swallow us up. And the way to do it is through freedom of speech, which is what they want to take away from us. And I think someone like Elon Musk realizes that and realizes the gravity of it and has given us this platform where we can all talk and organize. And as voters, we still have, I think, the capacity to organize and to vote and to find new leaders to say, to reject what is being imposed on us. And it's the decay of universities, it is what they're doing to schools, but it's also this concerted effort to silence us. Remember, the censorship of the 90s, it was called political correctness, and it was an effort to shame. They didn't use the law to silence people. And it was the same in the 2000s. And even just now with cancel culture and the pylons on social media, people were not using the law. Now it's the law. It is what you've seen after the riots. What this government has done, they have introduced a new horror show that we haven't seen ever before. People putting words and images online and then being arrested. British prisons that are full, clearing out convicted criminals who committed violent acts and all sorts of horrible things, to put in prison this sort of fast-track justice. People who have put words and images online, we're now using the awesome powers of the state to censor and to silence, using this very sinister phrase, legal but harmful. That has to be met with the greatest opposition of all time. This is something I think the hill we all want to die on. All of us come out into the streets and say, stop right there.
Hi, it's Brendan here. I just wanted to remind you that you can still buy my book. It's called A Heretic's Manifesto, Essays on the Unsayable. And I've really been blown away by the response to it from readers, reviewers, Spike supporters. People really like this book, and I think you're going to like it too. It covers all the insanities of our time, from climate change hysteria through to COVID authoritarianism, through to the trans ideology. And it basically makes the case for more freedom of speech, more debate, and more heretical thinking to challenge the conformism of our times. So what are you waiting for? Go to Amazon right now and order my book, A Heretic's Manifesto, Essays on the Unsayable. And now, on with the show. Yeah, I think one of the most extraordinary things in Britain over the past couple of weeks is that we had a situation where a 53-year-old woman from Cheshire was jailed for 15 months for writing something pretty obnoxious. No one's going to question that. She wrote a Facebook post in which she said, blow up the mosque with the people in it. Every decent person agrees that that is an ugly sentiment and an incitement to violence, right? And it's technically against the law in this country to incite violence, although the law does seem to be applied rather differentially to different people. But she's been sentenced to 15 months in jail, even though she's the sole carer for her disabled husband. I am of the view that that is far too stringent a prison sentence. And this week, a man of Muslim heritage from Bradford was given a suspended sentence for violently attacking 3 women who he said looked like prostitutes. So that man a man of Muslim heritage, violently attacked 3 women and won't spend a minute in prison. This woman will spend 15 months there for something she wrote on Facebook. So it is a scary situation.
It's almost as if they want the breakdown of social cohesion, because when you apply justice like that, you're going to have a whole swath of the population who say, this is not my justice. I don't believe in it. Why should they be paying taxes? Why should they vote there? It's not their justice system. This is so crude and so horrible. And like you, I condemn all kinds of violence. I condemn the riots. I condemn people saying, blow things up and burn mosques and things like that is reprehensible. And there's no buts or anything about that. But to apply the law differently to different groups of people, and especially to mistreat the people whose country it is originally. I am an immigrant, and I'm a very grateful immigrant that these countries were willing to accept me, grant me legal residence, and then give me all sorts of things. But I realize I'm an immigrant. If you came to Somalia and you started to behave the way Muslims are behaving, you'd be turned into minced meat in no time. And so we've always been saying we don't want Western countries to be like that, but now we are becoming like them. We're using the awesome powers of the state to lock people up for things they say, for things they exchange. And in Canada, it was even going to go after what people think or what they might say in the future. It was getting pretty ridiculous at that point. So this is really, really bad. And in terms of, I think we talked about Islamophobia. But what this man that you described, who didn't go to jail for what he did, to litigate against him would become, of course, Islamophobic. We're getting to a place where I really don't know how you're going to go forward from here, because yesterday I read a headline in one of the British papers that there are only 100 places left in prison. And so you are going to have to release more and more dangerous people onto the streets to lock up people for things they say and think.
Yeah. Indeed. Just a quick thing on the woke question. You've already touched on this. You write about it. It is a grimly fascinating topic. But just to tie things together, I wanted to ask you how you think the woke Islamist alliance will pan out. I mean, because at the moment we have such ridiculous movements like Queers for Palestine, the kind of people who would be thrown off the top of a building if they ever went to Hamas-ruled territory. You have blue-haired, gender-fluid young people on privileged campuses in the West cheering on a radical Islamist movement that is homophobic, misogynistic, and so on. It seems so odd. It also curiously seems to make a weird sense as well. You can see the bonds between these two groups in terms of their anti-Westernism, their anti-democracy. But how do you think that's going to pan out? How do you think that alliance is going to fare in the future? Will one side be victorious? Will the other side be crushed? How do you see that working?
So it's like, who's useful idiot, right? And I really recommend to all of your listeners to watch this lecture by Yuri Bezmenov, a KGB dissident in the 1970s. He gave this lecture in 1983. But there's one line where he says, and I think he is in some sense referring to the woke left before we called them woke. But he was talking about how the Soviet Union used subversion as a means of infiltrating an open society, demoralizing its institutions, creating instability and chaos, and then taking over. And the Soviet Union did that in so many different places. And he gets to the point of then what happens with these useful idiots. And he says they'll crush them like cockroaches. And so the question is it the Islamists who are going to crush the woke like cockroaches? Now, in 1979, that's what happened in Iran. In Iran, there was a coalition of the far left, this revolutionary left, and Ayatollah Khomeini, the Islamists. And when the Islamists came to power, They massacred the left, they exiled them, they killed them, they silenced them, and that was that. And I've seen this in many other places, but for the first time in the West, we are seeing, if you walk into the corridors of power in America, that's the most powerful country in the world. If you get hold of those levers of power that America has and you're woke, are you going to crush the Islamists first? Or are you going to go after GOP? Let's say you've crushed the GOP. Will you go after the Islamists? I mean, is it even realistic to think that Islam can take over America? Right now, it seems like beyond science fiction. But it doesn't seem that way in France or in Belgium or in Sweden or even to a certain degree in Britain. These things have to do with birth rates. It has to do with just the sheer determination and how well organized they are. And so it just might be that the woke left on this end of the Atlantic, they get crushed. But before we even think about such horrible things and horrible scenarios, I want to leave your listeners with, please let's fight these forces. We don't want it to get that far. And we can do it only through freedom of speech. So freedom of speech gives us the ability to talk about these things and to revive and restore our institutions of morality, of education, of security and defense, and our governments. And so the only way to do it is to expose. And that's what freedom of speech gives you. And then to organize, and then to vote, and to kick them out of power. And then to grapple, because this is the one thing that in the West right now we have to grapple with, is our constitutions should not be suicide pacts. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood and its tentacles, as it's established in Britain and in France and all of these European countries and even in America, we should review that and say, what can we do about this cancer in our midst, this tumor, Islamist tumor, without at the same time becoming horrible, autocratic, unfree societies? This is the big philosophical question.
Ayaan, thank you very much.
You're welcome.